January 1st, 1959, the Cuban Revolution, having been led for 5 years by the Castro brothers and Ernesto Che Guevara against the dictatorial Batista regime, came to an end with the victorious rebels marching into the streets of Havana. 6 years later, on October 3rd, 1965, the Communist Party of Cuba was established, thereby officially making the Republic of Cuba a communist nation, an ally of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. In 1965, the world was in the midst of the Cold War, whose alliances and pacts are shown on the map seen here. The US and USSR were bitter rivals, and the last thing the US wanted was a communist nation in what it perceived as its backyard. Just 3 years prior, the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought Washington and Moscow to the brink of total annihilation, with Havana as the ground zero for it all. How did the Cold War affect Cuba and its people? What are the effects of the ideological conflict in the present day? Let's take a look at one of, if not the most defining moment in Cuba's early history as an ally of the communist nations of the world, the Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1961, the United States government had grown to be very angry with the communist turn that the Cuban Revolution was taking, although the island had not yet officially converted. Fearing an ally of the Soviet Union being only 90 miles away from its own territory, the US decided to have the CIA train Cuban exiles for an invasion of the island, whereby they would overthrow the Castros and plant a government friendly to US interests. On the night of April 16, 1961, the invasion of Cuba began in earnest. Just the day before, B-26 bombers, which were painted to be disguised as members of the Cuban Air Force, attacked 3 Cuban airstrips in preparation for the following evening's attack. At around midnight, on the border between April 16th and 17th, the exile force, having traveled from their training sites in Nicaragua, landed at the Bay of Pigs along the beach known as Playa Girón. Though the exiles were initially successful, a Cuban counterattack, led by Fidel Castro himself, quickly devastated them. As the invasion faltered and it became more clear of the US's involvement, the Kennedy administration decided against providing further air support to the exiles. As a result, the invasion force was soundly defeated by the 20th of April. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a disaster for the United States and the Kennedy administration. The failure of the exiles and the now apparent involvement of the US in their training became a political embarrassment, one that soured relations between the US and the Soviets as well as Cuba. For the Cubans, however, the invasion proved to be a boon to both morale and to their fighting spirit. The invasion showed the Cuban people 2 things: that the United States would do everything in its power to see them wiped out of existence, and that they could stand up to them if need be. As a tiny Latin American country, Cuba felt that standing up to the imperialism of the US would serve as a beacon of hope to countries both in Latin America and around the world that were being bullied and exploited by both the Americans and the Soviets. The failure of the Bay of Pigs would lead barely a year later to the harrowing Cuban Missile Crisis, known in Cuba as the October Crisis, of October 16th to October 28th in 1962. Fearing another invasion of the island, the Cubans requested that the Soviets station nuclear missiles on the island as both a deterrent and a possible defense. The Soviets agreed, and missile stations were brought into construction in the summer of 1962. When a US spy plane discovered these stations, they angrily demanded that the Soviets dismantle them and remove the missiles. Both the Cubans and Soviets refused at first. Thus, a tense showdown began between the nuclear powers, with Cuba caught in the middle. Though all 3 sides wished to avoid a nuclear war, Castro told Khrushchev that he was prepared to defend his country to the death if need be. On October 28th, with tensions having nearly reached the breaking point, the Soviets and the US reached an agreement, and the missiles were removed from the island. Castro was outraged, as he has not been consulted, and felt betrayed by the Soviets. These 2 major Cold War events have both helped shape the identity of Cuba in the present day. The invasion at the Bay of Pigs heralded the beginning of a 57-year-long antagonistic relationship between Cuba and the United States, with the US embargo against the Cuban economy still ongoing to this day. The perceived betrayal by their Soviet allies in the missile crisis led the Cubans to feel that they could not rely on anyone but themselves in their struggles against the United States. Since then, though the Cold War is at least technically over, the Cuban people still stand in proud defiance against what they see as a massive empire trying to crush their revolution. Indeed, it seems that the legendary words of Che Guevara still ring true to this day. Hasta la victoria siempre.